Hey everyone. Sorry, Deborah here. Glad to see you guys showing up tonight. Can everyone hear me? So make sure I'm not just sitting here talking to myself. So it looks like we should be getting started in a couple minutes. Okay, good. Y'all are shy. I was starting to panic, like, oh my gosh, there's something wrong. Okay, awesome. I'm so glad you can hear me. And you can see the screen. It says Smarter Parasite Management for Goats. And there I am. So welcome everybody. I'm so glad that you're here tonight. So it is 7 o'clock Central Time. So we are going to go ahead and get started. And y'all are not going to have to look at me very much tonight. I am mostly going to have the slides up. So tonight we're going to be talking about smarter parasite management for goats. And in case you're wondering, in case you don't know me, or what we're doing, just make sure you know you're in the right place regardless. Like if you are new to goats and you want to avoid parasite problems, that is awesome. That's the best case scenario. I have worked with people who got all the information ahead of time and never had a problem, which is awesome. That's really the way to do it. But if you've had goats for a while and you've already had experience and you've already experienced resistance to one or more dewormers, that's great. We're going to talk about that. I mean, it's not great that you had it. It's great that you're here because we're going to talk about it. If you've been deworming on a schedule, we're going to talk about why you need to stop doing that. If you've been deworming all your goats at one time, we'll also talk about why that is no longer considered a good option. If you've had goats die from worms, I'm really, really glad you're here. And if you don't want to learn everything the hard way, you are definitely in the right place. So what you can expect tonight, we're going to talk about why goats are more vulnerable to worms than sheep or cattle. Some of the people who have the hardest time raising goats are people who started with cattle. A lot of times people have a big cattle ranch and they think, wow, the cows are not eating a bunch of this brush. And so it feels like it's going to waste. We could make some extra money if we just throw a few goats out there. And if they try to treat the goats like little cows, they are going to have a lot of problems. And it's very hard to, for them to understand, like, well, why am I having problems? I've been raising cows for decades and doing fine. Why is this not working with goats? We're going to talk about how to use natural resistance and resilience to your advantage. We will also talk about why pasture management is key and how you can stop wasting money and worrying constantly. You can save money on dewormers, you can save money on fecals, and at the same time, you can have confidence that your goats are not going to unexpectedly drop dead from worms. So we learned it all the hard way. Basically, we bought our first goats in 2002, which I feel like was kind of like the dark ages for goats because people really did not know a lot about them back then. It is really surprising to people now, and it was surprising to me back then. People thought that goats and sheep were basically the same, which the first thing that always pops into my head is they don't even have the same number of chromosomes, okay? So I don't understand why people ever thought that nutrition was the same in sheep and goats, and that's a talk for another night. But they also thought parasites, issues were going to be the same, and they're not. Sheep and goats are very different. So there was just so much stuff that we did not know about goats back in 2002 when we got started. And so we lost our first buckling to parasites in 2004. And when that happened, I was told to deworm my bucks monthly. And I was told this by a professor at the University of Illinois Vet Clinic. So that's how far we've come. So if you have a vet that went to school back in the early 2000s and has not done any of their continuing education on goats, then they may still be using that same information that they learned back in vet school more than 20 years ago. So we started deworming the bucks every month, and we lost 2 adult bucks 4 months later. And almost lost another buck a month after that. And that was when I realized that we got a big problem, and I had no idea at the time how to fix it. I just saw a comment in the thing. At what point is it too late to deworm a pregnant goat? Never. However, we're going to talk about that. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, we will be talking about that later. So we had the problems with the bucks in the early days because the bucks were in a pen that was 64 foot by 60. And we had 5 bucks in there initially, and then 3 of them died. So we were left with only 2. And then, but the does they were in a place about 4 times that big. And then the worm problem started with the does. And within 4 years of buying our first goats, we had complete herd-wide dewormer resistance. And that meant that none of the dewormers worked on any of our goats on our farm. A lot of times if somebody uses a dewormer on a goat, they're like, oh, that goat has dewormer resistance. But it's not the goat that develops dewormer resistance. It's the worms on your farm that develop dewormer resistance. So if you had a goat that did not respond well to deworming, that may not be dewormer resistance. That is probably something else if it's just one goat and if you haven't been overusing that dewormer. So what did we do wrong? Basically everything. We dewormed our goats on a schedule, like the vet told us to. We used the wrong dosage of dewormer. We used too little, which is why so many worms were surviving, because the dosages on the bottles are not correct for goats. Not even the Goat Safeguard has the correct dosage. We dewormed all of our does after kidding. We dewormed all of our goats before moving them to a new pasture. That was like the first thing a vet told me. After a couple of years, a vet said, oh, well, there's this thing. You need to start rotating your goats. You can't leave them in a pasture. And you need to deworm all of them before you move them to the new pasture. And that actually is a mistake. We dewormed all of the goats when only a couple of them had a high parasite load, which, people say things and they're like, oh, well, this just sounds logical, right? If a couple of your goats have a bad problem with parasites, then it just makes sense that all of them do. And actually, it doesn't make sense. And if you do fecals on them, you will find that that's not true. They say that probably about 80% of the worms are in only about 20% of your goats. So we could have done worse because we did not deworm all the goats 10 days after the first deworming, which a lot of people talk about. I still see this so much. We had a post go viral on Facebook last year because we said, don't do a routine second deworming. And people were having a fit because that one is still so pervasive. But the reality is that if your dewormer works on your farm, one dose is going to do it. The reason people originally thought that this was true was because they would deworm a goat, stick them back out there on the wormy pasture where they would just pick up more worm larvae. So they would just replace all the worms that you just killed. And so they would deworm them 10 days later. But then the goats would be bad again, shortly, and you'd have to deworm them again. So it was like a dog chasing its tail. They just kept deworming and deworming and deworming and never getting ahead of it. Luckily, we never injected dewormers because injecting dewormers, the injected dewormers stay in the body for so long, anywhere from 2 to 4 months, depending on which dewormer it is. And if you do that, it stays in the body at a very low dose. It's not strong enough to actually kill the worms. And so that means that it's like the worms are being vaccinated. The worms are being exposed to this tiny dose of dewormer in the goat's body and developing resistance to it. And they're having babies that are resistant to it. So injecting dewormers in goats actually will cause you to have dewormer resistance even faster than if you only give it orally. And the other problem with that is that there's very long milk withdrawal. So what is our life today like with our goats? Usually we only wind up deworming 1 to 3 goats a year. And usually it's yearlings after kidding. that is a really huge ask for a goat. You've got a yearling, and you're asking her to, number one, keep growing. Number two, grow babies. Number three, make milk. Number four, fight parasites. And a lot of yearlings just cannot do that. In fact, this is one reason I'm really not a fan of breeding goats to kid as yearlings. I realize if people are trying to make money, that they want them to kid as soon as possible. But if you do that, that might mean that the goat is going to need a dewormer because her body just can't do all four of those things simultaneously. So most of our goats have never had a dewormer in their whole lives. And in the last 15 years, we've only lost one goat to parasites, and that was entirely due to human error because the goats were left on a pasture for too long. So how did we get to this point? Basically, it was because I started reading the research, and that started actually because of our problem with copper deficiency. When our goats were not getting pregnant, they weren't staying pregnant, I started reading the research, and I was looking for research very specifically on copper. And when I did that, I found one of the very first studies that was done by Joan Burke, PhD, she did a study on using copper oxide wire particles for worms because they were seeing dewormer resistance. And they're like, okay, it takes a very long time and millions of dollars for new drugs to get approved by the FDA. So what can people do if they've got dewormer resistance on their farm? And so she started doing experiments with copper oxide wire particles. And that was how I got introduced to the emerging research on parasites back in the early 2000s. And I got on a listserv that Dr. Burke had and was seeing all of the research as it was being done back in the early 2000s. And not only did I read that research, but I also followed the recommendations. And I learned the why behind the recommendations and when to apply it and all that good stuff that I'm going to talk about tonight. So remember I said that a lot of times people who have cattle have the worst problems with worms in their goats because they think that the goats are just little cows. Well, goats are very different because cows and sheep are grazers. So cows and sheep have gone through time consuming grass and eating off the ground where there is parasite larvae. Goats have not. Goats are browsers. And so they are eating from up here. They're eating from up high. They're reaching up and they're pulling leaves off of bushes and trees. There is no worm larva in the bushes and the trees. I tell people, when you put your goats in a pasture and close the gate, you are basically forcing them to eat from their toilet. And that usually paints a pretty vivid picture in most people's minds. And you really cannot expect them to stay healthy, especially because they haven't gone through time eating off the ground and having the kind of resistance and resilience that cows and sheep do. So we had cows for about a dozen years. I never gave a dewormer to a cow in all those years. And I was originally deworming all of my Shetland sheep when I got them because that's what everybody did. But once I went through FAMACHA training and learned about the latest research, I quit giving dewormers to my Shetlands and almost never gave another one to them. So I have seen firsthand, since we have raised cows, sheep, and goats, I have seen firsthand how goats are so different and have so much more trouble than sheep and cows. And it really boils down to the fact that in the wild, goats never eat from their toilet. They are eating from stuff up high. Even if they're eating weeds that are growing, growing on the ground, their weeds come up, several feet, and they've got leaves and stuff. And so still the parasites cannot get to those leaves and stuff on weeds like they can on grass. So how do we prevent dewormer resistance? The concept is very simple. We have to avoid overusing dewormers. Well, how do we do that? First, let me just, in case you're still not real clear on what dewormer resistance is, it's very similar to antibiotic resistance, which most people understand. We got this idea that all bacteria were bad and that we needed to kill them all. I know when I was a little girl and I would have a cough or whatever, my mother would take me to the doctor and he'd be like, oh, she's got a cold. I'm going to give her a shot of penicillin. Because even if I didn't have a bacterial infection, he thought that I should have that shot of penicillin so that I didn't get a bacterial infection. And at this point in time, we know that's a really bad idea because now we have antibiotics that don't work because the bacteria are able to resist the antibiotics. So that's the same thing that happened with worms in goats. So why do you not want to deworm on a schedule? Because the more you use a dewormer, just like the more you give someone an antibiotic, the faster the parasites will become resistant to it. And people were doing this with the incorrect assumption that they could prevent worm problems. In fact, there's a website out of Australia that still tells people to do this. And unfortunately, it's very popular. I have a lot of followers from Australia who told me about it. And I visited the website, and it's just shocking to me that they're still saying that you can prevent worm problems by prophylactically deworming your goats. Like, that's because it's just not true. Like, that's what people were doing before, and we wound up with dewormer resistance. So why do you not want to deworm the whole herd when only a couple of them have a parasite problem? Well, again, the more you use a dewormer, the faster the worms on your farm are going to become resistant. So, say you've got 20 goats and 2 of them have a worm problem. If you only deworm those 2, then 10% of the worm eggs being pooped out on your pasture are going to be resistant to that dewormer that you just used. Now, that's really not bad because 90% of the poop on your pasture is going to have worms that will die when they are exposed to that dewormer that was just given to those other 2 goats. So that's called Refugia. That's your refuge. That's the worms that are going to die when you give that goat a dewormer. And so if 10% of the worms in a goat's gut don't die when you give them a dewormer, the goat's probably going to get better, but let's say that you deworm the whole herd. You're like, okay, I got 2 goats that, have a worm problem. I'm going to deworm everybody because I'm sure everybody needs it. Well, then 100% of the worm eggs that are being pooped out on your pasture are going to be resistant to that dewormer. The only reason a dewormer ever works more than once is because everything that the goats pooped out yesterday is still going to be susceptible to that dewormer. But the longer that the goats are there and the more they poop out eggs from the worms that got that dewormer, the fewer and fewer refugia you're going to have, and the more and more the goats are going to consume larvae of worms that are resistant to the dewormer that you just gave them. Is everybody following? Are you guys keeping up? Am I clear? So why not deworm all the goats before moving to a new pasture? Well, remember I told you that's what, the vet told me to do after we'd had worm problems for a few years. She's like, give everybody a dewormer and then move them to a new pasture. And that was terrible advice because I move them to a new pasture. There's no worm eggs there at all. So then we don't even have the refugia from the poop from yesterday and last week. Now, 100% of the eggs on that pasture are going to be from worms that are resistant to that dewormer. So if you've got 1 goat or 2 goats that needs a dewormer and you've got 20 goats and you move them all to a new pasture, that's not a big deal. But if you deworm all of your goats and then move all of them to a clean pasture where there's no worm eggs, then every bit of larva that those goats consume will be from eggs that hatched from the worms that survived that dewormer. So now that dewormer is not going to work. So why not deworm all the does after kidding? By now, you guys should know the answer. The more you deworm your goats, the faster you're going to see resistance. But a lot of times people go, oh, but they have the periparturient egg rise. That was the big thing for the longest time that nobody wanted to get rid of. It's like, oh, well, we've got the evidence. They have a periparturient egg rise after they kid. There's going to be more eggs in their poop. Well, this is why we don't deworm based on fecals anymore. So that's an old practice that is not recommended anymore for multiple reasons. And I'm going to get into that in a minute. So just because your doe has a higher fecal egg count after she kids doesn't mean that she needs a dewormer. Dewormers, like antibiotics, are drugs that should only be given to sick animals. Like, you wouldn't give all of your animals an antibiotic just because they have bacteria in their body. You know, we all have bacteria in our body. A lot of it's good. Like, we need some of the bacteria in our body. You know, you've probably, if you haven't experienced this, you probably know someone who has had a problem where when they get antibiotics, they wind up with a yeast infection. That's because antibiotics are not selective. They kill all the bacteria in your body. So you don't want to take them if you don't really need them. And that's the same thing with your goats. You don't want to give them a dewormer if they don't really need it. Someone asked in the chat, how long is it best to leave a pasture till you rotate them back to a pasture? It depends. That is why this is not simple. I can't tell you like, oh, after X number of days, because it depends on a lot of things. And this is why I do actually do parasite pasture management plans with people when they have trouble understanding how to make the rotation work on their farm. So, and yeah, a different Rachel said the first time she heard about Refugia, it made her mind explode. It took a while and a couple of times to hear about it, to understand and for it to make sense. Yeah, absolutely. So, and then Dawn said, since goats eat mostly browse at a level they can't poop on, why are we so worried about worms that crawl up grass stems? And can you speak about a dry lot where the goats eat alfalfa fed to them? I think that's going to get covered. If it doesn't, ask me again at the end. But worms don't crawl up the grass. Larvae float up wet grass. That's how they get up there. And if your goats are eating mostly browse, that is awesome. Unfortunately, most people are trying to turn their goats into grazers, and that's why they have problems. So I interviewed someone on my podcast a couple weeks ago who had her goats on a farm where they ate all browse, and she never had a parasite problem for, I think, like 5 years. And then she moved to a new farm, had no browse and a lot of short grass. And all of a sudden she had goats dying from worms. So if you've got browse for your goats, that's fantastic. And, you know, that's one of the reasons that some people are still not believers in the whole dewormer resistance thing. And they're like, oh, there's no such thing as dewormer resistance. I've had goats for 20 years and never lost a goat. Well, that's probably because there is some reason, like maybe your goats are living in a forest and eating browse, or maybe you're in Tennessee and your fields are full of lespedeza, which is a natural dewormer. Or maybe you're in the deserts of Arizona where there is no grass. Like, there are so many reasons why someone may not have parasite problems because they just got lucky by being on the right farm. And if you're in the middle of rainy, wet Georgia and you're trying to raise your goats like somebody on the deserts of Arizona, you're going to have very sad results. And in fact, every summer, I wind up getting contacted by people who've moved from the mountains and the deserts out west to the rainy southeast where they have lots of grass. And suddenly they have goats dying. And they're like, I don't understand. I've been raising goats for 10 years. I've never lost a goat to parasites. I haven't changed anything since I moved. I don't understand why my goats are dying. Well, that's the problem. You haven't changed anything. So you're in a different place. And that's the problem with not knowing what causes what. That's like, if you don't know the science behind it, then you don't know why you've been lucky. So, so resistant worms only survive inside the goat for about 3 or 4 months and then they die. So that Rachel's question is complicated and would take me a long time to answer. We can come back to it later, possibly. I tend to go long on these things. I always want to go an hour and I usually wind up going way longer. So my goal tonight is to get done on time, but we can definitely come back to that. It's a very long answer though, which is why I want to keep moving right now. So another one of the things, so why don't you deworm again 10 days after the first deworming? Well, first of all, this was just 10 days was a number that was just pulled out of thin air, literally. Some people say 7 days. Some people say 14 days. The answer is, if worms are not resistant to the dewormer you're using, you do not need to do a second deworming, because that first deworming is going to kill every worm inside the goat that is susceptible to it. And then people say, oh, but dewormers don't kill eggs, which is true. Eggs don't hatch inside the goat. So eggs hatch on pasture. They have to have oxygen to hatch, number one. And number two, it also has to be the right temperature. And eggs will not hatch if it's over 100 degrees, which the temperature inside of a goat's body is like 103, 104. So there's 2 strikes against the eggs hatching inside the goat's body. One is it's too hot, and the other one is there's no oxygen, so they can't. And then some people go, oh, well, they can hibernate. There's this thing called hypobiosis. And so they can come out of hibernation. So it's the worms coming out of hibernation that you're trying to kill inside the goat with that second deworming. Well, the problem with that is that it's unpredictable. There is not only is there no evidence that they come out of hibernation it's kind of crazy to even that anybody ever got the idea like, oh, they're going to come out of hibernation magically 10 days after you gave them a dewormer, or 7 days or 14 days, because it's just not based on days. It's based on things like weather and the goat's condition and that kind of stuff. That is why after a goat gives birth, you see the periparturient egg rise, because actually giving birth is one of the things that their immune system is stressed. So that's one of the things that causes the goat, if there are any worms that are in hypobiosis inside the goat, they come out of hibernation and they just start laying eggs like crazy. But depending on the individual goat, that may not necessarily make them sick. Their immune system might be strong enough to handle that. So basically the bottom line is that you should be monitoring the goat's condition. And after you give a dewormer, you should be monitoring the goat's condition and treating with a different drug if you don't see an improvement. Because if you don't see an improvement, it might mean that the drug didn't work. And it may not have worked for multiple reasons. Maybe you have dewormer resistance to it. Maybe it's expired. Maybe it got left, in the cab of your truck and it got overheated. It was like 140 degrees in your truck And so that it doesn't work anymore. Maybe somebody mistakenly put it in the refrigerator. And so now it got too cold and now it's not going to work anymore. Like, you've got to make sure that the dewormers you're using are like always kept to the correct temperatures. Don't use them after they've expired. I know nobody likes to waste money, but my husband did this a year ago. You know, he gave a dewormer to a buck and the buck didn't get better. And I said, okay, we're going to do a double deworming this time. And then I went to do it. And when I picked up that dewormer that he'd used, I saw immediately, like, this was expired 4 months ago. This is why it didn't work, you know? So don't use expired drugs. But basically, you should be monitoring a goat's condition. And if they don't get better, then you need to be taking action. And not just necessarily giving them another dose of what you just gave them that didn't work. There may be other management stuff that you need to do too. So the reason you don't inject dewormers, I actually kind of got ahead of myself earlier and talked about this a little bit, but basically when you inject ivermectin, there's a 40-day milk withdrawal. I don't know anybody who wants to milk their goat and dump the milk for 40 days. So if you are milking your goat, like, that right there should be enough of a reason not to give it to them. The milk withdrawal on moxidectin, the brand name Cydectin, that's actually even longer. It's like 3 or 4 months. So again, nobody wants to milk their goat for 3 or 4 months and dump it. Like, that's just crazy. So those injectables were originally made for cows, and people use them on beef cattle that are out on the range, and they're not milking them. And it even says on the label, not for use in animals producing milk for human consumption. And it is shocking to me how many people don't know that. It says that on the label, and that's why it says it. And here's another horrible social media myth. I've heard people say, oh, that's just because they haven't researched it. Oh, no, they've researched it. And the reason it says that is because the milk withdrawal is so insanely long. It's just not practical to do that. So your goats should be getting better right away as soon as you deworm them. Unless they are like, if their eyelids are completely white, their body condition is down to like something between a 1 and a 2. And at that point, you know, you could be looking at a goat that could die tomorrow without a blood transfusion. So it really depends on how anemic the animal is. The more anemic they are, the longer it's going to take for them to recover. I have had one buck that this is back when we had, in the days when we had dewormer resistance. I had a buck that was down for a whole week. Never could stand for that whole week. His eyelids were completely white. I did not know about the possibility of a blood transfusion back then. And he died after 1 week. However, I've also had a buck that was so weak he couldn't stand for 3 weeks, and he still recovered. So there is no single answer for this. And you know, if the eyelids are just really light pink, they should get better right away. Like, you should see them pinking up. You should see them getting darker really fast, like within days, and they should be improving. And the other thing is, it's really important that when a goat has white eyelids, like, you need to keep them in a stall by themselves. There's so much stuff you have to do. Like, I've got a whole article on my website about what to do when a goat doesn't improve after a deworming, because you need to increase their protein so they can rebuild muscle. You need to make sure that they're not consuming any more worm larvae. There's a lot of stuff that has to go into that. So what should you do instead of all the things so we've just told you, like, all these things that you should not do. So what should you do instead of that? Oh, Allison, I'm so glad you said that. You asked, Is it safe to inject ivermectin in non-milk producing animals like wethers? No. I'm so glad you asked because I jumped ahead too fast. You guys need to participate more. Can anybody tell me why you think, like, let's look at this. You got a 40-day milk withdrawal. What does that tell you about the ivermectin? And if you've got a 3 or 4 month milk withdrawal for Cydectin or Moxidectin, what does that tell you about that drug? That drug is staying in their body for a really long time at a very low dose. Rachel says it acts slowly. It doesn't act slowly. It's just weak. Yes, exactly. Heather's got it. If you were to butcher it, the wether would still have that drug in its meat. Yes, I forget what the meat withdrawal is for these. I work with a lot more dairy goats, so I've got the milk withdrawals in my head. But the meat withdrawal is also really long. So, and then Denise says the drug stays in the bloodstream for a minimum of 40 days. Yes. And then Rachel says it increases resistance. Exactly. And then Jamie said, wouldn't an oral drench be different than an injection? Yes, absolutely. That is why you should always give dewormers orally in goats, because the withdrawal, it stays in their system for a much, much shorter time. I always look these up because there are 6 dewormers and I don't want to get it wrong. So I always look up the oral ones, but most of the oral ones are going to be somewhere between 7 and 21 days. So not nearly as long as the injected. So somebody said that Moxidectin is the best dewormer. I'm so glad you said that, because that is not the dewormer that you want to use at the beginning. There is no such thing as the best dewormer. And that is actually one of my pet peeves when people say, what's the best dewormer? Because I want to use the best dewormer. I'm going to get to that in a minute. So let's talk about what you do instead of just routine deworming and all these things I said not to do. So you only treat sick animals. And how do you know they're sick? Because you do the 5-point check. So I think everybody now has heard about FAMACHA, which is you check the lower eyelid to see if they are anemic. And when you pull down the eyelid, you want that to be a nice bright red. The brighter the red, the better. I actually had somebody contact me once who thought her goat had pink eye. And I was like, oh my goodness, no, that's wonderful that your goat's eyelids are so nice, bright red. That means they're not anemic. They don't have any problems with anemia. They don't have a problem with barber pole worm. That's fantastic. So the lighter the eyelid, the lower the PCV, the packed cell volume. So if your goat is really, really weak and you really love this animal, or it's a high value animal and they have white eyelids, it would be a really good idea to take them to the vet to get blood drawn and have them do a PCV and tell you what it is. Because once it is below 17, they're going to have a white eyelid. Now, if it's 15, you can probably treat it at home and it's going to get better a lot pretty quick. But if it's like 10 or single digits, then that animal might need a blood transfusion. Otherwise, it could die, because that's just going to be really, really hard to overcome. So the level of anemia once you have white eyelids is impossible to know without a blood test to check the actual PCV. But once you can see some pink in the eyelid, you're at least up to 17. And so the chances of survival are much better. But it's also going to depend on the goat's own individual resilience too. So the second thing we have here is that you look under the jaw. Now that's a little tough with a buck because of their big bushy beard. But bottle jaw it looks like swelling from where the hinge of the jaw is all the way out to the chin. So it literally is like right under the jaw. If you see it in the middle of the throat, that would be the thyroid. That would be a goiter. And so this is very different. This is literally like right underneath the jaw, right underneath the salivary glands on the jaw. And if you see that kind of swelling, it's called bottle jaw, and that is a symptom of parasites. And so if you see that, you're probably also going to see anemia and poor body condition and some kind of poop that's not right. So now for body condition, you want the goat's body condition to be about a 3. Now it's kind of confusing to some people because the anemia chart goes from 1 to 5. 1 is the best, 5 is the worst. 5 is white. And people sometimes get these backwards. So I'm always double checking with people when they message me or something and they say that their goat is like a 2 or a 4 or a 1 or a 5 because, and the way I remember it is because actually I took my first FAMACHA class all the way back in the day when actually the FAMACHA cards did not just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They said A1, B2, C3, D4, F5. So basically they gave them grades A, B, C, D, E. So that makes it really easy for me to always remember A1. You know, that's the best. This goat has a grade of A. I really wish they would have stuck with the letters. Like if they had to drop one, I wish they would have stuck with the letters because it's very confusing that goat body condition is also on a scale of 1 to 5. However, 3 is perfect. 2 is underweight. 1 is emaciated. Remember, 3 is perfect. So if you go up to 4, that is overweight, and 5 is obese. Now, the buck in this picture is probably a 4. He's a little over-conditioned. So you want to check the body. So he definitely does not have a problem with worms in this photo. The body condition here is excellent. And in my parasite course, I have pictures of all the body conditions so that, you know, you can see what those look like. You also look at the condition of the coat because if a goat has internal parasites, their coat might look rough just because their immune system is having some challenges. But this also could indicate external parasite problems. So if they have lice or mites, which mites cause mange. So the coat condition is another one. And some external parasites can also cause anemia. And then the last one is that you look at the tail and see what kind of poop you've got coming out of that goat. So you want it to be pebbles. Pebbles are best. But if you wind up with, so typically it's interesting, barber pole worm, which is the one that causes anemia, usually causes the goat to poop logs, which logs are halfway between pebbles and diarrhea. And that is, I find that really weird because there are other worms that cause diarrhea, other roundworms. So the barber pole is a roundworm, and there are other roundworms like bankrupt worm, brown scour worm, and things like that. And those can cause diarrhea. Somebody asked about treating for mites with injectable or pour-ons. Because of the issues with, it is really not recommended that you use injectables on goats because of the resistance problem, even if they're not milkers. If they're milkers, then you've got that issue. But pour-ons work for mites and lice. And the thing is, injectable does not kill biting lice. If it only kills sucking lice. So the pour-on, and like, who actually takes their lice and goes and looks under the microscope to see whether they have sucking lice or biting lice? Just use the pour-on, and that kills both of them, and it also kills mites. And this is one thing that I've got memorized, and that is because Eprinex pour-on is approved for goats in the European Union, and you use it at twice the cattle dosage, and there is zero milk withdrawal. So I love Epernex because there is zero milk withdrawal, and it is approved in the EU. So can barber pole logs ever be from a new green pasture? Yep, absolutely. And that's something that you want to rule out, though. So like if your goat has nice bright eyelids and their body condition is amazing, and you just turned them out on spring pasture and they're now pooping logs, maybe even have diarrhea. Everything else that you're seeing on that goat is telling you that something they're eating is what's causing the abnormal poop. So these things all work together. Like you're not just going to see, like, if you saw a goat that was anemic but was like fat, and like there's something else causing that anemia other than worms, because a wormy goat is not going to be fat. And kind of the same thing if your goat is really skinny but does not have anemia, and it's got diarrhea, then that's probably a worm, but it's not the barber pole worm. So the barber pole worm is the only one that really causes anemia. The other intestinal roundworms will cause goats to lose weight and have diarrhea. In fact, one of them is called the bankrupt worm. That's the nickname for it, because they say it won't kill your goat, but it will make you go bankrupt. So, especially because your goat's not going to have any meat on its bones, and if it's a dairy goat, it's not going to be able to produce milk. So you want to, so that's not good. So the goat might not be anemic at all, but they've got very poor body condition and diarrhea. And of course, the other thing you need to look at that too, if you're treating for that, is they might have yonis. So there are always multiple possibilities for any of these conditions. So it's always the combination of symptoms that you see that helps to lead you towards figuring out what the problem is. So why not do fecals? So first of all, this is one of the really huge myths on social media, is that you have to do a fecal to figure out which dewormer to use. A fecal will not tell you which dewormer to use, because all 6 of the dewormers that are recommended for goats kill all of the roundworms. So I'm going to repeat that. All of the 6 dewormers that are recommended for use in goats kill all of the roundworms. And so I see Sean's question here. So what dewormer would you use if not moxidectin that kills all the life cycle? So you are never going to kill all the worms. And thinking that we could kill all the worms is what caused this problem. You don't need to kill all the life cycles. You don't need to kill all the worms. The more you kill, the better. But you don't want to start with moxidectin. Moxidectin is the second to last dewormer that you should ever use, because once that fails, all you've got left is levamisole. And once levamisole fails, you got nothing. You're going to sit there and just watch your goats die, completely helpless to do anything. And that's where I was 15 years ago, 17 years ago, because nothing worked anymore, because I had not, they didn't have the research back then to know how to do it. So, whenever we do this, people are like, oh, well, nothing kills barber pole on my farm except X. So there's all kinds of reasons why that might be true. 1, you might be using the wrong dosage. 2, you might be deworming your goats and sticking them back out there on pasture. So unless you're doing before and after fecals, you don't really know exactly how many worms are being killed, but you don't need to know exactly how many worms are being killed. You just need to know if your goat is getting better. And if you use a dewormer and the goat gets better, then you don't necessarily need to know the exact number of worms inside the goat. Now, I know I am an insatiably curious person. I learned how to do fecals 20 years ago because I thought I had to learn how to do them to keep my goats from dying. And I haven't done one like in 10 years now, because I never had a fecal change my mind. Every single time that my goat failed the 5-point check and I did a fecal, all it did was confirm, like, yep, that goat has a high load of worms. So I hate to hear people say, well, I gotta get a fecal before I can give my goat a dewormer, because it's like a little bit of knowledge about dewormer resistance has really scared people into not using a dewormer when their goat really needs it. So if you got a goat that's got, white or very pale eyelids, that means that they've got barber poleworm. You don't need a fecal to tell you that if they've also got a very poor body condition and they're pooping logs. That's like 95% chance that your goat has a problem with barber poleworm. And if you give them the dewormer, even if they have another underlying condition, the dewormer is going to help them improve by just taking that load off of them so that they can also then deal with whatever else they're going to deal with. And so your goat could, so if you think you have to wait for a fecal, your goat could die while you're waiting for that fecal, because a lot of vets these days don't even do them in their office anymore. They send them out to a lab, and some people even mail them. And so it can take days for you to get your answer back. And in the meantime, you could have a dead goat. The next problem I see is, when you have these people who think that they have to wait, or that they think that they need to give a second dewormer in 7 days or 10 days, is that they think, oh, okay, well, I just gave him the dewormer, so I'm good now. And then in 10 days or 7 days or whatever, I'm going to give him another one. You need to be paying attention to the body condition, to the poop, to the eyelids, and doing all of the supportive care to make sure that your goat improves so that they don't wind up dying because that dewormer didn't help for whatever reason. And like I mentioned earlier, sometimes the only thing, if their eyelids are white, sometimes the only thing that will help them is going to be a blood transfusion if their PCV is down, like at 10 or less. So the other thing is that your fecals can lead you in the wrong direction in terms of treatment. And a goat so there's two different things. So we talk about resistance in worms. Resistance in worms is bad. It's really bad. But resistance in your goats is great. A goat with high resistance can have a fecal load of 1,000 eggs per gram, 2,000 eggs per gram, and not be sick. And so you don't necessarily need to give them a dewormer. In fact, you really shouldn't give them a dewormer, because if a goat they're pooping out that many eggs and you give them a dewormer, that means they are going to put thousands of eggs on your pasture that have eggs in them from worms that are resistant to that dewormer. And that's going to reduce your refugia. So a lot of people are like, oh, I want to give them a dewormer so that they stop pooping out all those eggs. Well, every worm that survives is going to be resistant to that dewormer, though. So there's some people do not want goats with high resistance on their farm. Oh my gosh, that's a typo. The second one should be resilience. Oh my gosh. Okay. I am always updating my stuff, and so oops, nope, I got it backwards. Resistant. I know people get this. So on the FAMACHA quiz, this is probably like the question that people get wrong more than anything. Okay, so a goat that is resilient Okay, a goat that is resilient can have a very high fecal load and they're not going to be sick because they're just very resilient. And so they're going to be pooping out a lot of eggs. Now, a lot of people do not want goats like this on their farm because they're pooping out so many eggs. And that is actually one of the reasons you could do fecals, is to say, I'm going to do fecals and get rid of all the goats that are pooping out thousands of eggs. But, oh, sorry, this should be resilience too. Did I just completely confuse myself? A goat with low resilience and resistance. No, resistance. Oh my gosh. I have never had this happen before. Okay. There, we're back. So if they're resilient, they can have a lot and be fine. But if they have, you can have a goat with a very low egg count that can be sick from a really low number. So if I have a goat that only has 300 eggs and is anemic, has poor body condition, and is pooping logs, then that goat is not going to be able to survive. Then that goat needs a lot of dewormer, like a lot more dewormer than a goat that has better resistance. Denise said, if I worm my goat and they automatically become resistant to the dewormer, okay, they is the worms. So if you worm your goat, the worms become resistant. The worms that survive. Yeah. So the worms that survive, because best case scenario is that a dewormer is going to kill like 99% of the worms. Now that sounds like a lot, right? Like you think, oh, well, that's great. It kills 99% of the worms. And that should be enough that your goat is going to be nice and healthy and not have any more problems if you kill 99% of the worms. The problem is, especially with barber pole, is that the barber pole is a very prolific egg layer. And I honestly had to see this number written over and over again before I believed it, that a single female can lay 10,000 eggs a day. Like I had to see that in multiple textbooks and hear multiple vet professors say it before I was like, really? That just sounds impossible. Because like these other stomach worms only lay a few hundred eggs per day. So, like the brown stomach worm, scour worm, bankrupt worm, all of those, they only lay a few hundred eggs per day. So that's the thing. If you see a fecal that's got 1,000 eggs or more, that's got to be barber pole worm, because the other stomach worms just don't lay that many eggs. And this is why barber pole winds up spitting out so many eggs on the pasture, and how a pasture can get so overloaded so fast because the females are so prolific and lay so many eggs. So what happens? Okay, so let me see. I see your second question. Does it happen the first time you use it? It happens to every single. So yes, it happens the first time you use it. The only reason that a dewormer works more than once on your farm is because of Refugia. So, so before you deworm your goat, you've got all the poop on the pasture with all the eggs. They're hatching and turning into larvae, and the larvae is maturing, going through the L1 stage, L2, L3 to become infective to your goats, which takes a few days. So if you deworm your goat today, then it's going to kill 99% of the worms. If it's a good dewormer, you've never used it before on your farm. It's going to kill 99% of the worms. That leaves 1%, which could still be thousands of worms, but there are going to be some worms inside that goat that survive. And all of those worms that survive inside that goat are going to be resistant to the dewormer that you just used. But if this is only one goat out of 10 or 20 goats, then that means that only 10 or 20% of the poop on your pasture is going to have dewormer resistant larvae in it. The other 85, 90, 95%, all the poop that was pooped out the day before you use that dewormer and all the poop coming from every other goat is going to have worms that are susceptible to the dewormer that you just used. So this is why it doesn't happen in the goat, because your goat is pooping out his worm eggs on your pasture. And when that larva hatches, any of your goats could go and eat grass that has that larva on it. So that's why it happens on the farm. Dewormer resistance happens on the farm, not in the specific goat. Does that help? And yes, the whole thing is being recorded. And so everybody gets to see my resistant and resilience brain fart that I just had. If you missed it, that's awesome. But yeah, the whole thing is being recorded. And so you should be getting, or all of you should be getting an email with the link to the recording. Usually it takes, within an hour, everybody should be getting an email with the recording. So, all right. Denise, let me know. And so the reason that continued use of a dewormer causes the problem on your farm is because now, instead of having just one goat out of 10 or 20 pooping out these resistant eggs, now you've got the percentage of the resistant eggs on your pasture is just getting higher and higher. The more you use that dewormer, whether it's in that goat or another goat, the more poop on your pasture with the more eggs that has resistant worms in it. So, oh, McKaylee, is that how you say your name? I love it. You homeschool. We homeschool too. So our kids, my daughters were so into goats. And one of them actually grew up and got a PhD in biological chemistry. So she totally credits goats for turning her into a science nerd. McKaylee. Okay, awesome. Do the eggs being pooped out die in cold weather? It depends on how cold it gets and how long it stays cold and how dry it gets. And like pretty much the answer to everything related to parasites is it depends. So if you're talking North Carolina cold, no, which is why the Southeast has such a problem. If you're talking Minnesota cold, yeah, a lot of them die, but not all of them, because some of them are going to be hibernating inside the goat. And then Denise asked if you can spray the pasture with dewormer. Unfortunately, no, you can't. There's nothing you can do. I know when I got started, people talked about burning their pastures, but they actually studied that, and burning pastures doesn't do it because it burns too fast. And so the fire is not in contact with the eggs or larvae long enough for it to happen. Yeah. And also, as far as eggs dying in cold weather, it depends on the worm. Like meningeal worm, what I'm talking about mostly now is barber pole worm tonight, because that is the number one killer of goats. But meningeal worm is absolutely wicked. It gets in the spinal column or brainstem of goats. And those things, they did a study with meningeal worm eggs where, was it the eggs or the larva? I think it was the eggs. Anyway, they stuck it in a freezer below zero for a whole week. And they didn't die. And I'm like, okay, well, where is it even below? Because at first you're like, well, why did they only wait a week? And then I'm like, okay, hold it. Where is it even below zero for a whole week? So that just means that we are all in trouble, because there is nowhere, unless you're going to live in the North Pole. And I have had some students in Alaska, in places that were like only accessible by helicopter. So there are people who do that. But for, 99.9% of us, we do not live in a place where it is going to be below zero for a whole week. So, so just don't even, like, nothing is going to kill meningeal worm on pasture. Like, that's just crazy. So actually, Joyce asked, can goats pick up worms in pasture from deer and elk? Deer, I don't know about elk, but deer do share some worms with goats. Again, it depends. Are y'all sensing a common thread here? It depends on the worm. Like, meningeal worm is actually a deer worm. It doesn't really hurt the deer, but it gets in the spinal column of goats and kills them. So, the answer on a lot of these things is it depends. It depends on what worm we're talking about. Like, everything is different for all of the worms. So where do fecals fit in? Now, if a kid has diarrhea, you might need to do a fecal to determine if it's coccidia or worms, because coccidia is a protozoa. And I think this is where some of the confusion comes in terms of like, oh, you need to do a fecal to know what dewormer to use. Because a lot of people use the terms parasite and worms interchangeably. And worms are a parasite, but there are a lot of parasites in this world other than worms. Lice and mites are parasites, but they're external parasites. And then coccidia is a parasite, but that's it's a protozoa. And so dewormers do not kill coccidia, and medicated feed. I sometimes have people tell me like, oh, my goats can't have worms because I give them medicated feed. Medicated feed has a coccidia stat in it, not a dewormer. So if it's like medicated goat feed that you feed every day, that has a coccidia stat in it. And that's not the same thing as like, giving them a cup of the positive pellet dewormer. Like, that's not really a feed that's not a feed you feed every day. But that's a dewormer. So that can get confusing. Sorry. So there's really, if an adult has diarrhea, it is not usually coccidia unless they've got some kind of a problem already, because healthy adults all have coccidia in their gut and they're usually immune to it. So, I had somebody recently contact me and saying, like, it was a really low number of coccidia. She's like, my vet says I should give my goats a coccidia stat because they have this. And it's like, it was a really low number of coccidia. And it's like, no, that's not usually something people treat adults for. And I don't think her goats they didn't even have diarrhea. So again, it gets back to that idea that like some people still have this idea that we need to have nothing in a fecal. And from a lot of the vet professors I've talked to, I think a lot of that comes from the dog and cat world, because like one of the vet professors was saying, dogs and cats live with us in our houses. And so we really want them to have zero worms, and they are in our houses. So that's possible because there's not a way for them, not always a way for them to get like reinfected again. So yes, we can have that, but you can't have that with any animal that eats off the ground all the time. And so it's unrealistic to do that. And then Sean asked, is there always supposed to be some worms or coccidia in goats so that their immune system learns to fight it off? Probably. And does their immune system kill them? They keep them under control, basically. Kind of like, remember I said we have a lot of bacteria in our body, but we've got good bacteria that keeps the bad bacteria and other things in balance. We don't know. Like, I've seen people hypothesize about like since parasites if parasites killed the goats, the parasites would die because they're species specific. They can't live. They can't just go live out in the environment, like Haemonchus contortus lives in goats, like if there were, and that's one of the few that like kind of spans a couple different species. They're in sheep and goats. So if there were no more sheep and goats, the Haemonchus contortus would be gone. There's a different Haemonchus. I never remember the name of it because I don't do cows really. But there's a different Haemonchus that lives in cows. But there are thousands of different kinds of lice, thousands of different kinds of mites, thousands of different kinds of roundworms. Like the worms people have are not the same as the worms that goats have, and that kind of stuff. So they're all gonna I always tell people, if somebody says that their fecal had nothing in it, I am always very suspicious, because there are so many reasons why a fecal could show nothing. I mean, one of them is like people have told me their vet said, oh, just go pick up some poop out of the barn. And I'm just like, no, you can't do that. The eggs have hatched. You're going to get a fecal with zero, unless the goat you just happen to get lucky and the goat pooped it out, 15 minutes ago. The eggs are going to hatch. And actually, if your vet says that, even if you know better and you go and you collect a fresh fecal sample, when you take it to the vet's office, then they're probably just going to let it sit on the counter where the eggs get hatched. So, like your fecal needs to be, if you can't do the fecal right away, the sample needs to be kept in the refrigerator until it can be done. And if you're going to ship it, it needs to be shipped on ice so that it stays cold and that they don't hatch. So if you want to have a herd that is naturally resistant to worms, you can use fecals to make breeding and culling decisions. So if you set it in your head, like, okay, I don't, if you don't want to have goats that are walking around with high egg counts, then, you might not want to keep those goats in your herd. I always say Mother Nature culled my herd for me, because I am not kidding when I say we had complete dewormer resistance on our farm 15 to 20 years ago. There were no dewormers that worked. Our goats were dying unless they were naturally resistant or resilient. So most of the goats that we have now are pretty resistant. In fact, the one goat that has died in the last 15 years was not a goat that was born on our farm. It was a buck that I bought. So yeah, Julianne says, I don't understand culling goats with high resilience. Isn't this better to have goats with high resilience? Yeah, I like goats with high resilience too. People just don't like the fact that they're pooping out a bunch of eggs on their pasture. But that's not a problem. Like, so what? They're pooping out a lot of eggs. If all of your goats have high resistance or resilience and you're doing proper pasture rotation, then it really doesn't matter how many eggs they're pooping out. So it doesn't bother me at all. But I know there are people who say they don't want to have goats that have high resilience that are pooping out a lot of eggs. Now, if you are in a situation where you can't do proper pasture rotation, that would be a situation where you might want to do that. But you could also do a dry lot, and bioworma is a possibility, even though I know it's extremely expensive if you have a lot of goats. So, and Sean said, yes, a fecal is only a snapshot of the eggs. That is exactly right. You submitted 2 samples from the same goat and gave it 2 different names. It showed 0 worms or coccidia on one fecal and several eggs or coccidia on the second from the same goat. Yes, that is exactly right. That was one of the things I heard early on, was that that a fecal is just a snapshot. And so And the thing that really brought that home to me was when my book came out, Raising Goats Naturally, I did a morning TV show, and I took a couple of my goats to the show, and they horrified everyone by pooping in the studio, which I mean, they, when they said, "Can you bring goats?" I just immediately said yes, not thinking about the fact that they might poop in the studio. And so they freaked out when the goats were pooping in the studio. And so I know that was like the most beautiful, perfect pebbles I had ever seen goats poop. Absolutely perfect. And then I got home. I had them in a dog crate. I get home, I take them out, and the one goat, the minute her hooves hit the ground, she pooped the biggest pile of tapeworms I have ever seen. Not kidding you. Like the most massive. I mean, it just looked like somebody had thrown a bunch of goat berries into a bowl of spaghetti. And I was just about had a heart attack thinking, oh my gosh, thank goodness she didn't. I mean, just knowing how much those people at the TV studio freaked out by just perfectly clean, normal goat berries, I can only imagine how freaked out they would have been if she had pooped out this massive pile of poop. And that, by the way, is tapeworms. And that was the fattest kid imaginable. And that's the thing too. Like, this is not on my slides, y'all. But tapeworm is not harmful to goats, but people can see it. And so it causes them to freak out. And they're like, oh my gosh, my goat has this huge, massive amount of worms. But then that's just an example of when I learned, like, oh yeah, back to Sean's point, a fecal is just a snapshot. I mean, this goat pooped like 3 hours apart. One, there were no visible worms, and the other one was just filled with visible worms. And they're tapeworms, which are not really harmful to goats, but that's just brings home the point that a single poop or a single sample is just a snapshot. So it's not really that accurate. And that's just why it's not a great thing to base your deworming on. I really loved it the first time I heard one of the researchers say, if a goat has, a FMACHA of 4 or 5 and a body condition of 2 and has a poopy butt or is pooping logs, I don't care what the fecal says, I'm going to give it a dewormer. And on the other hand, if a goat is fat and happy, has bright red eyelids, is pooping berries, I don't care if it's got a fecal of 2000, I'm not going to give it a dewormer. And so, because that's pretty much where I landed, after going through the whole dewormer resistance thing and reading all the research and everything. So I think it is awesome that Nancy is planning to get goats and chickens. And chickens are a lot easier than goats. We've had chickens for 23 years and we've never had a problem with any kind of parasites in chickens. So Q Hip and Steel says, what is your recommended pasture rotation? There is no recommended pasture rotation. That is like the biggest, it depends. It depends what's growing in the pasture. How many goats do you have? What breed of goats are they? What's, is it a grassy pasture or is it a desert? Is it full of evergreens or willow trees? Is it raining there every day? Or have you been in a drought for 3 months? Like and that has nothing to do with how fast your grass is growing. And this is why that one of the things that I do with people is sit down and ask all of these questions and go through all the things to figure out what pasture rotation looks like for you. because it's going to look different for everybody. So the bottom line is you only use dewormers when absolutely necessary, and you start with the weakest dewormer and continue to use it until it no longer works. So there's only 3 classes of dewormers. The white dewormer, and it's just convenient that they look similar. The white dewormers are Safeguard and Valbazen. You use Safeguard until it no longer works, then you use Valbazen. The clear dewormers are ivermectin and moxidectin. The moxidectin is the same thing as cydectin. You use ivermectin until it no longer works, and then you use moxidectin. And then the third class of dewormers are the ones that are solid. So that would be morantyl tartrate, which is the weaker of the two. It's a feed additive. That's what like positive pellet goat dewormer. And then the other one is levamisole, which is currently, you used to be able to get it as like a bolus, but it's currently sold as a powder that you have to mix with water. And levamisole, and basically the white dewormers are the weakest, and then the ivermectin, moxidectin, cydectin. And then ironically, that third class, you've got like the weakest in morantyl tartrate and the strongest in levamisole. And we have not even touched on combination dewormers, but that's whole nother topic that is another thing to talk about. It's hard for me to stop. The Parasite course is like 7 hours. So it is really hard for me to like try. I'm already up to 1 hour, 20 minutes. It's why it's really hard for me to try and be brief, because I keep thinking, oh, well, I want to tell you this. I want to tell you that. So management that you can use to prevent parasite problems, pasture rotation is the #1 thing that you need to do. And the biggest problem I see with pasture rotation is people putting their goats in an area that is way, way too big. I've seen people put 5 or 6 Nigerian dwarfs on half an acre and wonder why they never go beyond like, 20 feet from the barn. It's like, well, they don't have to. So pasture rotation, you need to have the goats in an area that's small enough that they are going to eat all the grass in about 5 days, and then you move them to the next area. You don't want to let them graze wet grass because larvae, so remember I said earlier, worms don't crawl up on the grass. First of all, they're not worms when they're on your pasture. They hatch into larvae, and then they go through multiple stages. They go through L1, L2, L3 before they become infective. And so when a goat eats an L3 larva, that is the one that is infective. Larvae have no way to crawl. What happens is if the grass is wet, they can float up on the grass. That's why they don't crawl out on the leaves of weedy plants and stuff like that. That's why grass is the big problem. And so if the grass is wet, then the larva is going to get up higher than it would if the grass was dry. So you don't, and then this is the other thing, you don't want to graze grass that's too short because the larvae are going to be down at the bottom. Think about where the poop is, okay? Wherever the poop is, like the poop falls down to the bottom. And so the poop is like down there. Usually it's going to be down around the dirt. And so those eggs hatch next to a piece of grass, and the larva winds it just like falls onto a piece of grass. And then when the grass is wet, it can float up a little bit. So that's why, and they say it can float. They say they have found it 4 inches and lower. But that's why I personally do not like to let my goats graze 6 inches, less than 6 inches. And I'm going to show y'all just real quick. This is my little trick here. So measure your hand. I know my hand is 6 inches. Oops, this is not a mirror. Okay, it's 6 inches. From the tip of this finger to my wrist is 6 inches. So I go out into the pasture, I put my hand down, and I always want the grass to come all the way up my hand and be at least 6 inches tall. If it doesn't come up to here, it's time to move the goats. And Nancy asked, what are good grasses? Nothing. Goats are browsers, so they really shouldn't have grass, but we're all trying to turn them into grazers. And that's where the parasite problems come in. So I think you said you are just getting goats. Please do not go brush hog all of your bushes and then email me and ask me what kind of grass to plant. And I hope you haven't done that already, because goats are browsers. So if you've got lots of brush on your property, that's perfect for goats. So do not let them graze lower than 6 inches. If you've got mixed species, that's great. And I'm talking here about cows, because like cows have different parasites. So if they consume goat parasites, they just digest them. And whatever parasites they leave behind on the pasture, if the goats wind up with some of that larva in their gut, they're just going to digest it. Sheep and goats do have the same parasites. They do have the same worms. So if you graze sheep and goats together, they count as the same. That's not mixed. Horses have different worms. Pigs have different worms. Chickens have different worms. And no, putting chickens on your pasture will not help your worm problems, because your chickens cannot see worm eggs. Chickens are going to eat fly larvae. And this is where this comes from. You put chickens on pasture after cows because the flies lay eggs in the cow patties, and then it hatches into larvae, and the chickens come along and eat the larva, and that's a lovely source of protein for them. But eggs from goat worms are invisible to the naked eye. So a chicken can't see something. A chicken cannot eat something that it can't see. The next thing says provide browse. So, and browse would be like bushes and trees and evergreens and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, if you don't have that on your property already, you can't provide it, because if you plant it, your goats are not going to be able to eat it for a long time, because they'll kill it. When I first got there, I kind of thought, oh, anything that's more than about a 6-inch trunk will be safe. Wrong. My goats killed quite a few trees that had 6-inch trunks. And unfortunately, they kind of did it all at the same time. It's not like they killed one and I was like, oh, I need to not let them near trees that have a 6-inch trunk. A tree has to have a pretty big trunk for them not to nibble at the bark and stuff. We had a bunch of baby willow trees around our pond. I mean, the baby willows were growing like weeds around our pond. And I put the goats there and they just gobbled up all those baby trees in no time. So if you've got something like that, that is lovely. If you can't do rotational grazing, and honestly, most people can do a lot more than they think they can. So many people, I have people tell me like, oh, I only have an acre. And like, well, if you've got 4 goats in an acre, you can probably do pasture rotation, because like I said, most people think they need a lot more area than they really do. That's like the single biggest problem I see with people who think they can't do it, is that they think they need a bigger area than they do. So the tree size is about 6 inches in diameter. So I'm not sure how to do the math on that. I remember it has something to do with pi. But yeah, so about 6 inches in diameter. So if you cannot do pasture rotation and you don't have any browse, then a dry lot is your next option. And a dry lot is very literally a dry lot. When I help people, I ask them to send me pictures, because I've had people say, oh, I have a dry lot. And then they send me pictures and there's like little sprigs of grass covering like a third of the area. And it's like, oh no, that's not a dry lot. Because all those little sprigs of grass, they're going to have poop on them. And if that's all the grass you have and it's only 2 inches tall, your goats are going to be nibbling at that stuff like crazy and consuming larvae. Like any poop that winds up on those little clumps of grass is going to, eggs are going to hatch and there'll be infected larvae there. So A dry lot, literally, a dry lot takes some effort. You really have to put them in a small area. And ideally, you're going to do something like put down road felt and then put down some kind of rock, whatever rock is available in your area on top of that, whether that's like some kind of, like around here, it would be limestone is what we have readily available for road rock. The next thing is breeding for resistance. So that is something that has been really, really important to us. So like I said, Mother Nature called my herd 15, 20 years ago. And so the goats born here are very resistant and or resilient. And so they do very well. The one goat I had die in the last 15 years was a buck that I bought from another farm. So that kind of told me a lot, because it's like, it was because of human error. Like they got left in an area for too long, but all of the goats that were born on this farm survived. They didn't have a problem, and he did. So obviously his resilience was not as good as theirs was, nor his resistance. Neither one of them was good. And then seasonal birthing. If people go and look on my blog from like 10 years ago, we were having babies here in Illinois in the middle of January. And I used to keep one of these old fashioned blogs where I wrote about, it's like an online diary where I wrote about all the things happening. And every time I would write about these sub-zero kiddings, people would be in the comments going, why are you having goats this time of year? And I even saw one of the reviews of one of my books. Somebody said, I was really wondering why they were having babies in the middle of January when it was like below zero. And then I learned it had to do with parasite management. So that is another possibility. And that is going to vary depending on what part of the country you're in. But in Illinois, if you have a problem with worms, then having your goats give birth when it's really cold out is the best option, because there's snow on the ground. So the goats are not picking up any worms whatsoever from the pasture, because our goats are on a diet of 100% hay from somewhere around early November until April. And so when the goats kid in like January and February, then they just did not have to deal with the parasites the way that they would if they were to kid in April or May. And now, like we do kid in April. We just had baby goats all last week. I was in the barn, with baby goats being born. And it's not a problem now because we've got everything dialed in. We're doing our pasture rotation. And actually for baby goats, I don't even let them, when the baby goats first go out on pasture, they go out on grass that has not had any sheep or goats on it for at least 6 months. So there is no larva. It is 100% clean pasture because there's no larva on there whatsoever. And so we don't need to deworm baby goats. Like I don't think we've dewormed a baby goat in probably close to 10 years. Between the nutritional program that we have, which is a talk for another night, but between that and the fact that their body is just not getting loaded up with gazillions of worms, our baby goats don't need dewormers at all. And then the last thing is tannin plants that are high in tannins. And these are going to vary from one part of the country to another, but it could be all sorts of things. Sericea lespedeza is the one that has been researched the most, and that grows wild in the southeastern part of the United States. So this is the thing where I said, like if somebody doesn't really know the research and they don't have any worm problems and they look like they're doing all the things wrong, like if they're in the southeast, that could be it. Like they could have pastures full of Sericea lespedeza and they don't know it, and they don't know that that's what's keeping their goats healthy. I think, oak is high in tannins too. That hasn't been studied as much. There have been lots of studies on Sericea lespedeza. We have, well, our farm is called Antiquity Oaks, and so we have tons of oak trees. And I'm not sure how much it helps them. Maybe it helps them now. Like, it obviously was not helping them 15 to 20 years ago. So, and a lot of this is dose related. Like, what they found with Sericea lespedeza is that basically the more they eat it, the less they're going to have a problem with worms. So, like, you can't just give them a tablespoon a day or a tablespoon once a week, and that's not going to do anything for them. Because they even sell Sericea lespedeza hay and Sericea lespedeza pellets and stuff like that, and those work just as well as if they're grazing pastures of Sericea lespedeza. Sean said, dry sunny pastures with 4 inches or shorter grass versus wet states with short grass. Is that dramatically safer in a state where it doesn't rain much? Yes, absolutely. What kills larvae is dehydration. So I have never, y'all are probably frustrated. Someone is like, oh my gosh, is she going to say it depends one more time? Yes, I say it depends a lot because that is the truth. I have never been able to get a single parasite researcher to tell me how long larvae can live on grass if it's raining almost daily. That, like, the best answer I can get is months, multiple months. Like, well, how many months? A lot of months. The larva can, it's, if they don't dehydrate, then they can just hang out for a really long time in that infected state. In fact, in 2012, we had a drought in Illinois. It did not rain for 3 months. Like, we are talking not a single drop for 3 months. And my goats were so fat and so healthy. I have Nigerian dwarfs. That was the only time I have ever had a doe go over height. Like, I've been working with the same genetics. I have not bought a doe since 2005. I buy a buck about every 5 years to bring in new genetics. But I had one doe that went over height, and I had some others that I was afraid were going to go over height because because there was just no parasite load at all. In addition to having zero rain for 3 months, like, we had no grass. All the grass turned brown. There was no green grass. And then it was also really hot. I mean, we had a lot of days where it was over 90 degrees. So the goats, if whatever worms the goats had, they would poop out those eggs, and they would either get baked while they were still in the fecal pellet, or if they did manage, because it was so hot, or if they did manage to hatch, they died really fast because it was so dry. So, and I am actually not sure how long I don't have an exact number for how long if it's dry either. But it's probably going to be really fast. I know I had absolutely zero worm problems that year when we got no rain. So, which is not what you want, because we also had no grass. Like, that was the most expensive year ever for feeding my goats. So anyway, like I said, my parasite course has got over 7 hours of videos and lectures in it, because there are so many things that I could not even begin to touch on here. The FAMACHA training alone, I'm a certified FAMACHA instructor, and so the FAMACHA training alone is over 2 hours. And so that's really cool, because I get to use all of the fun slides from the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. So, like, we actually have slides that show you, like, what the worms or what the larva looks like in a drop of water on a blade of grass. Like, So you can get a real good understanding for like what we're talking about there. So anyway, if you want to learn more, you can join my online course about parasites in goats. And I originally started this because I was going to conferences and learning from vet professors and researchers and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of people said to me, well, Jay, that's nice, but I don't have the time, or I don't have a farm sitter, or I can't afford the trip or whatever. And so I wanted to bring the conference to people who couldn't take that time or expense to go do it. And so it's not just me. I also have interviews with lots of experts in parasitology. And we've also got a bibliography in there of research, so you can see some of the studies and resource lists and all of that. So there's a lot of stuff in there that's all backed up basically on the research and everything. And this is like just a partial list of all the things that you'll learn in that course. Like I didn't even talk about why you shouldn't rotate dewormers, but that's another old-fashioned thing that everybody used to do, that were like, oh no, that doesn't help. That just makes you get dewormer resistance to all the dewormers even faster. And then how to correctly check FOMACHA scores and how to use the 5-point check and more. And then the course is $97 for lifetime access. And what I do now, the course is only available to purchase lifetime access in the spring when parasite problems are getting bad, because what I saw before is people would get it and then they wouldn't do it. And then they were contacting me when they were in a crisis. And so one of the things is I feel like you really need support with this. So when you enroll now, you've got like about a month to do a lot of the course. So it's just like, if you can just devote a couple hours a week to working on the videos, then we do a live Q&A on June 3rd, and you can ask any questions there that are more complicated. There are discussion boards on every single video. So if you watch a video and there's something you don't understand, then you can put the question there and I can answer it. But sometimes it's complicated, like because you've got a unique farm with unique stuff growing. You've got unique goats. And so sometimes it helps if we can chat for like 10 or 15 minutes about your very specific situation and how we can apply this information to your farm and your goats, because that's my goal, is to make you the expert on your goats on your farm, because you're dealing with a situation that is completely unlike any other farm. So that's why I want you to understand how all of this stuff works. And then also, because we're already at the end of April here, I'm also adding a pasture management training that's live on May the 22nd at 11 a.m. So that means, and I actually love to do this. This is so much fun, that we're going to have a live Zoom call and you will explain to me like what your specific situation is like, like how many acres you have or how many feet you have to devote to your goats, and what your housing situation is like, what the terrain is like, like, is it hilly? Is it flat? What kind of fencing do you have? And just so many things. So we'll go through all of that. And I love it when I can sometimes I can draw out on the computer a plan for your farm. And then you can also, and then the cool thing about a group coaching like that is that you get to see how I draw out plans for other people. And oh, well, if something changes on my farm and maybe I can do what that person is doing, or, oh, maybe one side of my farm is really hilly, but another side is really flat. And so we can go through all that different stuff. And then you're also going to get a template where you can keep track of your 5-point check for goats. And that's one of the things that's going to help you to notice, like, oh, wow, this is like the third time that this goat has had a dewormer. Or, oh, look at that goat. Like, that goat has never had a dewormer. Like one of the things I've done is that, like, if I want to keep bucks from does that do not need dewormers, like, that's one of the things I continue to do. Because, Mother Nature called my herd 15, 20 years ago, but now it's up to me to make sure that I don't keep goats and perpetuate genetics of goats that are not resistant and resilient, So I was sad when that buck died, but I already knew he was struggling. Like, I had already had to save him before. And if he'd been born on my farm and I had to give him a dewormer, I would have castrated him at that point. Like, I've done that. There's a video in my kidding course of, like, this is how you castrate a yearling. Like, that was a year. I kept 4 bucks from 4 of my favorite does. And when they were all a year old, one of them needed a dewormer. Well, guess who got castrated? The one that needed the dewormer. I wanted to keep the 3 bucks that were living in the same pasture with him and did not need the dewormer. And so that's where it really gets into management and, looking at the genetics that you have. So the course includes the FAMACHA training, the videos. There's a discussion board on every single lesson, so you can ask questions. Those notifications get sent directly to my inbox. Actually, we're on a new platform now, and I also get a pop-up. So, and on my phone, I get a notification. So people in my courses now get answers from me way faster than they used to. If you're not in my courses or my membership, you can ask questions on Facebook, but Facebook and Instagram and stuff and YouTube, they get checked twice a day by team members. And my team members will respond by, like, giving you a link to an article or something. And if they need me to respond, then they'll let me know. So it's a lot longer to get a response because I keep myself busy. Usually I work about 40, 50 hours a week, and my students and my members are my top priority. And I'm super thrilled that I have 3 fabulous team members who work with all the other people who are, like, sending messages on Facebook and stuff. So once you're in my classes or my membership, then you've got a direct line to me. You also get access to all the updates and additions that I make to the course in the future, which is pretty much all the time. I am constantly adding to courses whenever new research comes out, or even when, like, somebody asks me a question and I realize, like, oh, this would really be good to have a video on this. I'm going to go make a video on this. And then you also are going to get access to any live trainings I do in the future. Like, everybody who bought this course last year is going to get an invitation to the pasture management thing in a couple weeks, and then the Q&A in June. So, and we don't usually have too many people come, but that's an option for you. There are some people, I just sent out a FAMACHA card today to somebody who bought the course last year. So there's no deadline. If life gets in the way and you can't get around to it, everything's there as long as you need it. And you don't have to hurry up. It's not like you got to do it now or it's too late. So, and then once you learn all of this stuff, you'll understand why you do or don't have parasite problems on your farm or with specific goats. And both of those are really important. Like, if you don't know why you don't have parasite problems, that could change tomorrow. And you won't know what to do. You'll know how to use the dewormers only when you need them. You'll know the correct dewormer dosages for goats. Unfortunately, nothing online ever dies. So there's all kinds of stuff out there. And I just continue to be shocked by some of the dosages. Like, oh my, I don't know that anyone is ever going to beat the person who contacted me and said that she was told you're supposed to use 8 times the dosage on the bottle for Safeguard. Like, that is just for barber pole. Like, oh my gosh, please don't do that. So there's just, I think stuff just, I don't know how stuff can get messed up so much online. It's like the old fashioned telephone game where everything just gets changed a little bit, you know, through each person until it's something really not helpful and possibly dangerous. So you'll know what else you need to do after you give a dewormer to help your goat recover. You'll be able to create a rotational grazing system that works with the number of goats that you have and also your property. Or you'll know how to create a proper dry lot if rotational grazing is truly not possible. And really, most people, probably 80% of the people who tell me they can't do rotational grazing can do rotational grazing. They are just misinformed on how it actually works. And so then you become the expert on your goats, your worms, and your farm. So you know how to handle them. You can absolutely manage parasites successfully on your farm. My goats are not special. Like I said, I haven't bought any does since 2005. I bring in a new buck about every 5 years to keep some fresh genetics in there. And the key to the success is knowledge. Like, you really need to know like the science behind it to make it work. There is a reason goats were never popular in this country historically, and that's because they're desert animals and they're just not gonna, and most of the United States is not desert. Most of the United States has lots of grass and the perfect climate to be, you know, worm heaven. And worms absolutely thrive in most parts of the United States. And so if you know how it works, though, you can raise goats successfully. So, and then questions. Oh, I should tell you guys, I just thought about this. I just realized I should give you guys the link to the course. Oops. Hi. See, Joyce said, I used pumpkins for several years for natural dewormer. Have you done that or have any info on it? So the thing about most of those is your goats probably didn't have a worm problem to begin with. And if your animals don't have a problem to begin with, then whatever you give them is going to look like it works. But pumpkin seeds, most of the natural, I don't remember the numbers on pumpkin seeds. And if that one specifically, it's been a long time since I looked at pumpkin seeds. Years ago, when my goats when we had dewormer resistance on our farm, I tried literally everything and I could not get my goats to eat pumpkin seeds. I tried. For most of these things, the amount that they actually have to consume is really high to make any kind of a dent at all. Like, I know there was a study about papaya seeds, and I actually went and bought a papaya. And then I discovered that the amount of seeds needed, like one papaya had enough seeds to treat one goat for 3 days, and you had to treat them for multiple days. And so that just didn't work. But there's nothing wrong with letting your goats eat pumpkin seeds, but just, I'm fine. Like, if somebody wants to give their goat something natural, that's totally fine. But where this becomes a problem is I cannot tell you how many people have contacted me with absolutely classic, like their goat is totally failing. They're like, they contacted me because they want to know, like, what do I need to feed my goat to put weight on it? And then I asked them, like, well, what color are the eyelids? White. What does the goat's poop look like? Logs. It's like, okay, your goat has worms. Oh no, that's not possible. I give them an herbal dewormer every week. Well, that actually doesn't work. Like, it's fine. It's not going to hurt them, but it doesn't keep them from getting worms. And so, if you want to give your goat pumpkin seeds, that's fine. But don't assume that your goat can't have an overload of worms just because you're giving them pumpkin seeds or anything else. And the whole idea of the organic wormers so it's kind of funny you said I think you mean an uninhabitable environment. I've seen that explanation and it's not true. So I literally tried everything, y'all. I even tried a garlic tincture from a certified Native American medicine man. Like, I tried it all. I tried wormwood tinctures. I tried fresh wormwood. I tried dried wormwood. I tried basic H in my goat's water. I tried apple cider vinegar in my goat's water. Nothing kills worms other than dewormers. Nothing kills them at the level you need to kill them if they are really sick. When we actually, and I learned to do fecals, remember? And so that's why I'm not just going, oh, well, the goat didn't get better. I'm telling you, it didn't kill the worms. So I was using Molly's herbal dewormer when my buck, Tennessee Williams, died from worms. That was the buck that that was the buck that was down for a week before he died. And I was giving him, her instructions say, to give them a tablespoon, I think, every week. And then if they have a worm load, you give them 2 tablespoons. Well, I was giving him 2 tablespoons like every day, and I was repeating fecals, and nothing was happening. So it did not kill any of the worms. And the reason why, because I contacted Dr. Burke and I asked her about that. And she said, there's probably just not enough wormwood in it. Like, we know wormwood does kill some parasites, but if you're only giving a tablespoon and it's mixed, it's like, it's like about, I don't know, 7 or 8 herbs, and wormwood is just one of them. And so the amount of wormwood they're getting is way less than a tablespoon. Okay. So this, because after talking to her, I actually decided to start growing my own wormwood. And I'm like, okay, well, because the other thing too about herbs is that the amount of the active ingredient is going to vary depending upon where it's grown, how much water it got that year, how fertile the soil was. Like, there's so many things that are going to make the potency of herbs vary from one place to another. So I'm like, okay, fine. I will grow my own wormwood. And let me tell you guys, if y'all decide to grow your own wormwood, that stuff is invasive. It overtook my mint. All right. So anyway, I grew my own wormwood, and before and after fecals, like, so I did a number of different things. So first of all, I had 3 wethers that I was going to butcher. And because one of the things is that people who sell these mixed herbs will say, like, oh, too much is not, is harmful. So I'm like, I can't. And I also talked to a botanist about this. And all he really said was, well, wormwood, it's what they make absinthe with, and it's addictive, which really made me laugh. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have drug addicted goats if I feed them wormwood. Is that what you're telling me? And so anyway, I grew my own wormwood, and before and after fecal shows that if you I let this dough, well, the first thing I did was I put a whole big pan of wormwood out for 3 wethers. Then I'm like, okay, guys, well, I'm going to butcher you anyway. So here, have at it. And it was kind of funny because one of the wethers wanted it so badly, he was butting away the others, which made me think about the drug addicted goats addicted to wormwood. And so he was butting them away. And I was like really nervous the next day walking out there, like, oh my gosh, is he going to be okay? And he was totally fine, completely fine. And he had hogged all that wormwood to himself, like this big pan of wormwood. And then, so it being dangerous, so I don't know what level it would be dangerous at, because he ate a lot and he was totally fine. And so then I let my does eat it, and they were fine. And I had one that wound up with a high load of parasites, and I weighed out an ounce of wormwood, and an ounce of wormwood is a lot. It was like a bowl like this of wormwood. And I let her eat as much as she wanted, and then I weighed it afterwards. She had wound up eating about half of it, so she ate half an ounce. Now, a jar of spices is usually like a 1/10 of an ounce, a 20th of an ounce. It's not much. So she ate a lot, way more than that little tablespoon that most people will tell you, to feed your goats if you're buying an herbal blend from them. And that amount of wormwood killed 50% of the worms. And that was it. So it helped her. So if I had not done the fecal, I'd have been like, oh, wormwood works so great. Like, it totally helped her. However, it only killed 50% of the worms. So if she would have had white eyelids, killing 50% of the worms probably would not have helped her. So that's why, like, you really need to see the whole picture. And if you're doing something that's not proven, then in that case, I would say doing before and after fecals. Like if you want to try something like pumpkin seeds or something like that, doing before and after fecals would be very interesting to do. So I just realized I never gave you guys the link to the course. So if you want to learn more about the course, I'm terrible at this. Like, I just get so excited talking about this stuff. Oh gosh, what did I just do? It needs to go here. There. I get so excited talking about this stuff that I totally forget things like, oh, I should give you all the link so that you can see, what all more information about the course and what you want to do if you want to purchase it. So other questions. Dr. Michael said, are you referring to Duddingtonia flagrans? No, I'm not sure. That was 6 minutes ago. I don't think that's biowerma. I thought that this question popped up when I was talking about something else. Duddingtonia flagrans, like, that just became my new favorite word as soon as I heard about it. That is biowerma, and it does work. So if you cannot do, a lot of people were excited about this, but it is very expensive. So it's really only practical if you've got some really expensive animals or a small number of animals. Like this, it's very expensive to feed biowerma to a lot of goats because it has to be fed every single day because it doesn't actually kill the worms. What happens is it's in their poop on the pasture, and it interrupts the life cycle. So it reduces the parasite load on your pasture. So if you can't, or it's a fungus. It's a fungus that I don't remember if it's the eggs or the larva, but it's a fungus. So that's a cool thing. So it's not toxic, and it's not the kind of thing that worms can become resistant to. Like, you cannot become resistant to being eaten by a fungus. So Katrina asked about copper sulfate or copper oxide ware particle. Copper sulfate is a very, very hard no. Copper sulfate is very easily absorbed. And so it is very easy to kill a goat with copper toxicosis if you give them copper sulfate. And I actually know people who have done that. There is a rather old book that some people can get their hands on. It's over 20 years old. And it talks about using a copper sulfate drench for worms. And I know people who have killed their goats when they did that. And the other thing is Dr. Burke is the one who I think I counted one time like 15 studies that she had done on copper oxide ware particles. Copper oxide is not well absorbed. It is actually just tiny little bits of copper that winds up in the goat's stomach and kills barber pole worm. And that actually, there's a lot of studies that have shown that it does kill barber pole worms. And before she did that, she started researching copper oxide. She looked at all the research literature on copper sulfate, and it doesn't kill that many worms. And the line between where, like you're going to get any effect at all and the toxicosis is very thin. So it's just not worth it. Sean says that his goat specialist vet just told him a week ago to only worm using the 5-point check. That's awesome. I'm so excited to hear that. That makes me so happy when I hear that. So yeah. Awesome. And then, and if you're going to deworm for 2 or 3 classes, you want to make sure that you are using from different classes. Like giving a goat both ivermectin and moxidectin is like you're overdosing them. And they both have exactly the same mode of action. And so you're not going to get any benefit from that. And they need to be from different, classes to have that synergistic effect. McKaylee wants to get through winter without buying hay or feed. Would planting deer clover be a good idea? So I don't know what part of the country you're in, and I'm not familiar with deer clover, so I would have to research that. But I can tell you that when people try to grow all of their feed, that the goats wind up suffering. You can do that with sheep and cows. That's why goats are harder. So, because you can totally do that with sheep and cows. You can get away with not giving great minerals to sheep and cows. Like sheep and cows are grazers. Goats are browsers. They have much higher mineral requirements. I keep thinking tonight, like I need to do a nutrition class soon. And so I don't know anyone who's ever successfully managed to not buy hay and feed. I can tell you, we tried to grow our own hay. And the problem is, unless you spend thousands of dollars on proper hay equipment, you think you've saved a lot of hay, and you haven't, because modern baling equipment compresses those bales in a way that is impossible for you to do. So like, we actually thought we had this incredibly clever idea. We filled up our kidding pens with hay. I mean, that looked like one kidding pen looked like, should have been like 20 bales of hay, right? That should have lasted a long time. No, they ate that stuff up so fast. So the other thing is, if you have pet wethers, which I'm assuming you don't, but if you have pet wethers, they're very easy keepers. They have very low nutritional needs. And honestly, a lot of people wind up killing them with kindness by overfeeding them and giving them things they don't need. But if you want your goats to produce milk for your family, then they need to have a high protein diet, which is, you can't give them a high protein diet unless you're giving them some kind of a legume hay. In most places, that's going to mean alfalfa. In Texas, you said you're in Texas, that's going to mean alfalfa. If somebody's in Georgia, that could mean peanut hay, or Sericea lespedisa is also a legume. But they need that for the calcium and the protein. And then you also need a 16% protein goat feed. Otherwise, what happens is you wind up with very skinny goats with parasite problems, with low production of milk. And I just had somebody contact me who wanted to buy my goats, and I have an application. And so I asked, and part of the application asks, what do you feed? And she told me what she fed, and she was trying to like feed her goats without buying purchased feed. And the reason she wanted to buy some of my Nigerians is because they were better producers than her Alpines. And when I saw what she was feeding, I said, I don't think you want to buy my goats, because they're not going to produce the way you're expecting if you don't feed them. Like what you're feeding your goats does not have enough protein and calcium in it for my goats to produce at the level that they're producing here on my farm. And that's probably why your Alpines are not producing better. And she had gotten her grain mix approved by a Facebook group, so she thought she was doing good. But anyway, and so I said, that's probably why your goats are not producing more, is because there's not enough protein and calcium in their diet. And I gave her a link to one of my YouTube videos where I talk about this. And after she watched it, she wrote back and said that could also be why they have parasite problems and they're underweight. And it's like, yeah. So, peanut hay, is peanut hay too much protein for boys? It's not. Well, it depends. It depends. I told y'all I'm going to say that all night. During breeding season, that actually might be great. Like, because during breeding season, boys get crazy and they're not paying attention to like the fact that like, oh, I'm hungry. They're just thinking about the girls. And so giving them peanut hay then might be good. Alfalfa has too much calcium in it for boys. I know peanut hay is a little bit lower, but I would actually be more worried. I'd be worried about the calcium. And then the question too is, are you raising boars, and are you trying to get them big and meaty before you process them? Because if long-term health is not your goal, then peanut hay would be awesome. Like, you're going to get them big and meaty and, a great hanging weight and stuff. So again, it depends. The way that you feed meat goats that are going to have like a 7 or 8 month life is very different than the way that you're going to feed a dairy buck that you want to be, making babies for like 8 years. So, if you want your bucks to be productive for a longer period of time, because too much calcium can cause zinc deficiency in bucks. Like, the most common cause of zinc deficiency in bucks is too much calcium, and that comes from alfalfa. Basically, I buy alfalfa for my does and I buy grass hay for my bucks. And so my bucks all get grass hay, my does get alfalfa. Rachel said, do the combination dewormers cause resistance to multiple classes at the same time? Yes. And so that is why, like, when I first saw them saying there's an article out there that's written by a very reputable parasite researcher who says the time for multi-class dewormers is now. And I'm like, why would you do that on a farm that doesn't have a problem with resistance? Because if you do a triple combination dewormer, you have just created a world in which there is one dewormer. And so I just don't trust people to be smart about deworming if they haven't had any kind of training. I mean, some people get it right, but I've just seen so many people get it wrong. One of my Goes 365 members a year ago bought a goat from a farm that sounded like they were doing everything right. Okay. So he was in, he joined Goats 365. Before he got goats, he knew all the questions to ask. This woman sounded like she could have been writing the book on proper dewormer use. She's like, oh, I never deworm a goat unless they need it. And, because it causes dewormer resistance. And she just went on and on. And it all sounded so perfect. And then he gets the goat and she hands him this medication history sheet. And he emails me and he goes, I think I just bought a problem. This goat had gotten a dewormer every single month except January. Every single month, this woman thought the goat was anemic. And this is just the most incredible example of placebo effect and confirmation bias and all the things, because she said, oh yeah, well, she always recovers though. I give her a dewormer and I give her a dose of red cell and that just makes her eyelids pink up again and she's great. And that is 100% impossible. Okay. If you really, and I'm sure that was not the only goat that was getting dewormed that much. There is no way that a goat is. So first of all, there was a study done on red cell and it showed that a 30 cc dose of red cell did not increase the PCV of a goat at all. It did not improve anemia at all. And this woman was giving the goats 5 cc's of red cell and saying, oh, that takes care of the anemia. It's no, your goat, clearly you are you're seeing things you think your goat's anemic, you give it the dewormer and the red cell, and then you think that's going to make it better. And it magically does. And then next month, the goat is anemic again. And you do this. And she did it every single month except January, and I mean, and she even knew oh, well, the science behind that, oh, well, worms just aren't as bad in January because it's so cold. And that is just one of the best examples I can give you of how when somebody hasn't actually had training, that they can think that they're doing it all right, but they're not. So, Dr. Michael says it's a nematode predatory fungus that entraps the worm larva in the mycelium. Yes, thank you. I always have to reread the bioworma stuff to remember exactly how it works. But basically, it does work. It works great. It's not something that goats can become, or I'm sorry, it's not something that worms can become resistant to. However, it is something that is just very expensive if you have more than a few goats. So, and that's pretty much been the only complaint I've ever heard about it. Everyone I know who's used it says it's great, but they just couldn't afford it long term. So, in the long term, doing rotational grazing. And the thing about rotational grazing too, that's actually cheaper, is that you're not putting up permanent fencing. You're using the temporary electronet. So the fencing for doing it is not that expensive. And we are still using fencing that we bought 20 years ago. We've got, I think, 15 or 16 rolls of it because we use it all over our farm. We use it for our goats. We use it for our sheep. We use it for our chickens. We use it for all of them, and it works fabulously. So I dropped the link in the chat one more time. And I'm just going to give a quick look through the chat to make sure I got all of the questions. Irene says, you would love a nutrition class. Awesome. I love talking about nutrition so much. And then Michaela, clover, I don't know deer clover specifically, but clover is a legume. So just in general, that's a good clover is a good food. I don't know if this is a problem with deer clover, but I know some clovers, if your animals are on it 100%, it can cause bloat if they eat too much of it. So it's not what you want to feed 100%. I knew somebody during our drought in 2012 who said the only thing that did not die in his fields was the clover. And then he started losing, he had sheep. He started losing lambs to bloat from eating too much clover. So I don't know if that is a problem with deer clover or not, if it's like specific to some types of clover or not. I'm gone back quite a ways. I don't think I see any questions that I haven't answered. If you've got something, this is your last chance to type that into the chat. In general, for rotating, it under most conditions, deer clover is not, I get it. Deer clover is a mix. Oh, yeah. I thought deer clover was like, well, here we have red clover and we have white clover. I'd never heard of deer clover. Okay. It's a mix. Yeah. The fencing that I use is here. I'll put it in here. Premier One Supplies. They have a website that you can go to, and you will see all kinds of fencing there. Like, I very specifically recommend the poultry fencing for poultry and the electro net for sheep and goats. I have heard of people with kids that got tangled up in the poultry netting because some people look at the poultry netting and go, oh, well, this would be better for Nigerian dwarf kids because the squares are smaller. But it also has strings, vertical strings, instead of plastic struts. And so that's got more give, and it's easier for kids to get tangled in it if they try to go through it, and they get stuck and then they get shocked. Yes, they can. Like, Nigerian dwarf kids can go straight through the electro net when they're small. But if they're dam raised, they don't usually try. They want to stay with mom. So if they get shocked, they run back to mom instantly. Bottle babies are a little bit more challenging to train to it because you're mom. And so you have to be there and make sure that they don't get through when they get shocked, because that can happen. But I would much rather have them get through than have them get tangled and wind up with a tragedy. So you're welcome, Samantha. Y'all know I could talk about this like all night long. My brain does start to, I think my brain starts leaking after a couple of hours. But I definitely love talking about this stuff. So if that is it, I'm going to let you guys go so everybody can go to bed, especially anybody who's been hanging in there on the East Coast. I know it's an hour later. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you've got questions, you can hit reply on any of the emails that you get from us, and that'll go to Amy and Tammy who respond to the team emails. So, and if they can't answer your question, they'll send it on to me. So I will talk to you guys later. Good night.